Sword Quest last year was a competitive tournament based solely on fish tag and release. We set 3 satellite tags in partnership with NOAA Fisheries. We're here at Bobby Boyle's shop, which is the home of sword fishing. The best guys in probably anywhere, or most of the best guys from everywhere, are right here tonight. And Eric from NOAA is going to go over the data from the 3 swords we satellite tagged. There were several other spaghetti tagged, and we're getting ready to do this again in June. But in our model, we need to make sure always that whenever we collect the data, we share it back to the fishermen.
Our program is a not-for-profit, all-species, international tagging program. Our goal is to come alongside the charter captains. We offer them tagging supplies for free, and then we do research expeditions, and we satellite tag swordfish, roosterfish, blue marlin, striped bass. We got an incredible study in the Northeast for striped bass.
The satellite tagging program is awesome, man. It's one of a kind, innovative, very, very cool. Actually looking forward to seeing what comes of all this research that's been expounded on over the last year or so. So we're definitely looking forward to seeing what results Roxanne has for us, and NOAA, of course.
These 3 fish went from Florida up to Nova Scotia, and then one went from Nova Scotia all the way down to the Cayman Islands.
Temperature on these fish shows a very interesting model of why these fish are at the bottom and all of a sudden they're up where we're fishing our jugs. And it shows a cold water pocket along the bottom, because there are some days you can't get a jug bite no matter what you do, and then you go out 3 trips in a row and you do. And when you look at these depth ranges and overlay the temperature on the fish, it's crystal clear that that fish is going to bottom, and then there's this pile of cold water for 30 miles, and the fish won't go near it. And those are the days we think, based on Eric teaching us, that's why those fish aren't down on that bottom rod, they're up in the jug.
Everything that I've seen, basically speaking, in the wintertime they end up in the Caribbean Sea, and in the late summer they end up on the Flemish Cap. And the vast majority, from everything I've learned, go down the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and a few of them come back down the Straits of Florida.
All of these pieces of this puzzle are based on what you see right here. All these hardcore pros. Recreational guys, private boats, they tag some fish, but they don't fish a lot. You know, Bob's gonna fish the next 4 days. You know, the charter boat guys that we work with fish 300 days a year. And that's how you get fish tagged and recaptures.
Where do the swords go?
When they're not in the boat already?
Let's get started.
Yeah, it's on now, sucker. Time to get tight. To all my homeboys around the world looking for a 500-pound sword, looking for the nickel, this one's for you. Gulf of Mexico, Texas, South FLA, New Jersey, Cayman Islands.
Sword Quest was a little bit of a dream of mine because there's so much history right here at Bobby's shop, RJ Boyle Studio. I mean, everyone shops here. Bob is the swordfish guy, and I fished with him a long time, and we had so much fun learning and killing and fishing, and this part of it for me is even better just from sharing all the data, you know. Our tagging program is international, it's around the world, it's every species. This one's super special to me. I live right here, and we've spent a lot of time, money, and aggravation trying to figure these out. We're super happy to have Eric from NOAA here, who's going to interpret some of this madness on this data. It's really complicated, but there's a lot of cool stuff. I need to start out by asking anyone in this room if they don't know Mike and Mike from Outboard Specialties. Anybody not know Mike? Mike, please. Mike said when I told him what we wanted to do, we wanted to buy a few tags, and he goes, as long as it's Suzuki only, I'll pay for the tags. Thought we were going to have 3 boats, mine, his, and Bob's. Well, there were 18 or 19, and people were mad that they didn't get invited last year. We didn't really do a good job of setting up the marketing because we didn't know if anyone would want to do it. We're doing it again. Roxanne is here. June 17th, which is a Friday, a weekday, so hopefully if the weather's bad, we get the lay day on Saturday, whatever it takes. We've already got commitments for more tags from sponsors. Mike and these guys aren't even big-time sword fishermen, but they recognize that their market and their business is right here locally, and there's so many sword guys. I had a problem with a pump in my boat yesterday, and I dropped it at Mike's this morning at 8. Needed a full rebuild on this big trim pump. He calls me at noon, come get your pump. I mean, he keeps all of us going, and Mike, we really appreciate what you did, and Mikey and the whole team, but a little round of applause for these guys. We've got a ton of sponsors behind us in this program, but again, when it's a friend and a local guy that keeps us all running, it's even more special. I really appreciate Eric Orberson coming from NOAA. Steve Waters is here, Captain Bouncer. Can't do this kind of stuff without these guys. And my hat is off to everyone. I hope you all want to do this again. Again, it's going to be Suzuki only. We've offered any of the charter boats with inboards, they can fish it, but if you got a Yamaha Merc, you can't go. So Mike's the guy putting up the money for the SAT tags, and we want to have the captain's meeting here at Bob's again. This shop is sword fishing in South Florida. I don't know of another one that's like it. If you need something done, come here. I mean, that's how it works. But thank you guys all for coming, and hopefully you find this as cool and interesting as I do.
Just start out a little quick bit on swordfish, where they are and why they move. So they're mesopelagic predators, so they spend most of their time during daytime down deep with the deep scattering layer, 400 to 500 meters, so 1,500 feet or so down. And then they travel up at nighttime with that deep scattering layer and feed daytime and nighttime. So they have something like called a brain heater that's back behind their eye, so that allows them to function at depth and be able to see and stay down at depth for a long time. Tuna have this, and billfish species. So that's kind of how they're capable of spending time at this great depth for so long. And a little bit about how the PSATs work. So we use wildlife computers, mini-pat tags. So these tags were put on the fish. They measure pressure, which gives you your depth, temperature, and light level every 3 seconds. And it archives it on the tag itself. And we pre-program them. Usually we put them out about 240 days. There's always a balancing act. The longer you put them out, the less data you get back due to data transmission issues. So, and then when the monitoring duration is up, that little nose cone will pop off, and the tag floats up, connects to the Argos satellite system, transmits the data back to us, and then we don't actually physically have to touch the tag again to get some of the data back, which is really great. And there's upgrades coming in. They're going to be putting in some low-level satellites as well in the next 2 to 3 years. That's going to help transmissions even further, so we should get more of the data transmitted. But before we get into it too far, there's some things to keep in mind with satellite tag data. So, well, we know the release location because we get GPS on the boat. We know the pop-up location because the tag's at the surface connected to the satellites. We really don't have a great grasp on the track movement. There's pretty big errors associated with them because you're using light-based geolocation. Since the tag is underwater, it can't connect to satellites. So it uses light curves and the brightness of light and the depth of the water column, and it runs an algorithm and determines the most likely location. And then we filter it. So we have there's a Kalman filter, they call it, a sea surface temperature filter. So what it'll do is it gives you an estimate of where that position could be, where it thinks that fish could be, somewhere in here. And then it looks at the sea surface temperature and says it was 28 degrees that day. And it tries to refine the point, knowing it couldn't have been here because it's 26 degrees here. So it helps refine it a little bit, but still, sometimes you might have errors up to 100 nautical miles, which sounds like a lot, but for an HMS species, that's not too bad because we're looking at big, wide migrations. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. It depends on how deep the fish was. Swordfish is one of the toughest ones to work with, and how clear the water was. There's all other things that affect the accuracy. But still we have a pretty good idea of the track, but just keep in mind when you see it points right on the edge of a shelf, it could be 40 miles off the shelf. We're not tracking exact locations. So, and while the tag archives the data at 3-second samples, it has to bin the data and summarize it to transmit it, because that's over 5 million data records. So it would never be able to transmit all that via satellite. So it gives us kind of summary blocks of time and tells us how deep it went in that time, proportion of time spent at different depths. And then, as I said at the end there, we have limited battery life and satellite coverage. So you're still going to get some gaps in the transmitted data, but you get a good idea of where they're moving to, and you get enough data that you can fill in the gaps. So In 2021, unfortunately with COVID, we were restricted. I wasn't allowed to go out on the boats and tag, so luckily Gray Fish Tag was able to go and take some of the tags. And the first trip was with Nick Stancic, where they tagged a little bit smaller fish, a 65-pounder. And then during Sword Quest, they were able to tag 2 fish in May, a 240-pound estimate and a 120-pound estimated fish. So pretty decent sized fish. If we look at the first fish that was tagged with Nick Stancic, that was down in the Keys. So you can see at the beginning of the track in February, March, it pretty much stayed down in the Keys and kind of worked its way up, but never really went that far north. Only went up to about North Carolina, spent a little time off North Carolina and looped back. And then on the right-hand side, this is basically the average depth range per hour bin. So this is basically on an average day, the fish would be somewhere between these two lines. At nighttime up at the surface, and then at daytime it would dive down to 1,500 to 2,000 feet. And so here's some of the archive transmitted data. The gray line here represents the maximum depth, and the dots are temperature depth combinations. And so you can see here, there's this period at the beginning when it was tagged, it was diving deeper, 2,000 to 2,500 feet. And then it moved into a water body that's much colder and it was shallower. You can see it was about 1,500 feet. But the purple and black colors here are like 43 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was colder there than it was here. And if you look after that period, water at 2,500 feet was about 54 to 57 degrees. So you're talking 1,000 feet deeper and much warmer. And that cold body of water was right in through this region here. So it was still in the Florida Straits somewhere, but for whatever reason it was in a little colder area where it didn't dive quite as deep, and it could be that was where the scattering layer was. And like I said, we know these positions are a little off. It could have been spending more time up on the shelf, but somewhere where there was cold, dense water. The deep scattering layer, so that's like a group of organisms, squids and mesopelagic organisms that kind of follow up and down with the light level. So when the sun sets, that group kind of migrates up near the surface, and the swordfish follow and feed on them. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are interested in effective moon phase on vertical distribution. So this first fish, we took a look, and this one actually looks like it does have a pretty good response. You can see on the new moon, these are some of those 4-hour depth bins I talked about. So we have 8 p.m. to midnight and midnight to 4 a.m. So you can see on the new moon, it spent a lot of time, almost 40% of its time in the upper 82 feet. And it spent the majority of its time between 328 and 656 feet. So the feet are a little weird because our bins are set up in meters, but I converted it because feet are easier for most people here probably to understand. It's easier for me to understand. So that's why it's a little bit funny binning, and pretty much the same thing for the midnight to 4 a.m. There's a lot of depth use in that 300-foot range. So I then broke it down into that period that included the shallower, colder, dense water, and the period after to see if there was any difference. And it did change its behavior a little bit, but the pattern seemed to kind of hold true, where it was shallower in the new moon phase and deeper on the full moon. And that can also be seen with the micronecton, so the deep scattering layer. This was by another researcher. They looked at the proportion of lunar illumination, so how full the moon is, and the change in the depth. So you can see as the light level grew from the moon, they tend to migrate a little bit deeper. They don't come quite as far up to the surface. So swordfish seem to follow that same pattern, or at least that particular fish did. So our second fish we have here, which was tagged as part of the Sword Quest on May 1st. That was our longest monitored fish, 241 days. And you can see it did a really big loop. It went up north. And if we look at this little region here, It's interesting that that area is called the Gully Marine Protected Area, so it's off Canada, and it's actually about a 1,500 square mile marine protected area where it was set up for marine mammals, but you can see, I don't know if you can see here, there's 3 zones. So zone 1 is this mid zone here. There's no fishing or take of any animals in that zone. And zone 2 and zone 3 on the outside edge do allow commercial fishing. But it's interesting that it spent so much of its time right in that zone, where, right in that protected area. And then, you know, as the water starts to cool down in November, it just started migrating straight back down south and popped up down near Grand Cayman. So this fish, also you see kind of a change in depth to shallower depth utilization. But if we look at this area, look at how cold the water is up there. You know, you can see that even at 500 feet, you know, it's about 50 degrees. So it's much cooler in that zone. And then this plot, if you look at this red line here, that's basically the same as that other image. This is the average depth across the daytime. So here is nighttime when it's up at the surface. You can see that red line. It was really close to the surface. And then as it goes down during the daytime. And the dots are month plots. So if you look here, these kind of aqua colored dots are May. So you can see if that was basically the average, and look how much deeper it was in May when it was down on its way up, you know, in the warmer water. And then you can see, you know, most of the dots above the line are when it was up on the marine protected area there. So this one have an effect on moon phase on vertical distribution. It doesn't appear really to. If anything, this one spent more time at the surface on full moon. So that's, you know, one of those things, well, why did it do that? When we compare it to the other fish, if we look, you know, here we see that strong pattern on new moon at the surface, full moon at depth, but we don't on the other fish. So if we look back at this figure, part of it could be it was up on the shelf there at nighttime feeding where it's not very deep, so you wouldn't expect to see a big change between moon phase. And you can see all the data points when it was up on that shelf area here were really tight knit. So that's probably part of why you don't see it. You can see here when it was down off Florida, you can see these aqua dots are actually quite a bit deeper than when it was up off Canada. So that's probably part of why we don't see as strong a moon phase response for that particular fish. And then moving on with the third tag, this one was 186 days, but it went the furthest distance from the release point. So it was over 2,600 miles to that little, to the furthest point way out here where it was almost to the mid-Atlantic ridge. So this fish, we found out recently, was actually recaptured by a Spanish longliner. We didn't know that at first when it transmitted the data. We didn't get great transmissions. I was a little disappointed. You know, it didn't transmit as long as possible, but it's probably because they put it down in the fish hold, the battery died, and it quit transmitting. And these trips last up to 5 months. So it was recaptured way back in November, and it's been sitting on their boat until they returned and gave it to one of their fishery organizers. And we provide a $500 reward when people recover these, because we also can return the tag and we get a discount on a repurchase. So the tags are about $4,000 alone for the tag, and then we can buy a second one at $2,000 if we return it. So it saves us some money, and we get a good data from it, and it gives them an incentive to report it. So like I said, over 5 million depth temperature readings. I just was able to look at a few things real quick, you know, beforehand, but I'll show you a couple things that kind of jumped out as interesting. So these two figures are depth and temperature. It's a little hard to see, I know, but sorry, I wasn't able to do better on short notice. But the blue is the depth, and this purple line, or pink, or whatever you want to call that, is the corresponding temperature for those depth plots. And this was pretty interesting. This point when it was way up north here, one day it only went about I think that's about 200 meters deep or something, really shallow. But when we look at the temperature for that, or 230 feet, not meters, sorry. But when we look at the corresponding temperature, it was actually below freezing. It was super cold, dense water it was in. So if we look, it occurred pretty much right in this region here. And I actually reran the track with the full data set. So we actually have more data, and it refines the track, but I didn't have time to put it together here. That track, I think, took it slightly more north here. So it put the data points probably about here. So right up on the Grand Banks. And if we look at like the currents in the area, you see that Labrador current. It's known for bringing down really cold, dense water from glacier melt from Greenland and right across the Grand Banks. And actually the Grand Banks are not very deep. Up on the bank it's only about 230 feet deep. So it was probably right up on the bank there in that cold, dense water, and then it moved on beyond it right after that. So it was kind of interesting. And then this is some of the actual archive data. So you can't really tell here because they're so close together. We have so many data points, but these are actually not lines. They're little tiny circles at 3-second intervals. So normally if the fish is moving really rapidly, you'd see more space between them to show when it's ascending and descending quickly. So for the first 5 days, we see the fish was hooked probably 1,500, 2,000 feet deep, and is brought up to the surface, stuck the tag in it. But then what kind of is interesting is it didn't go straight back down to 2,000 feet. It took a little bit to acclimate. You can see here it was going up and down between about 500 feet for a couple hours until it finally returned down to depth. And then it seemed to resume almost immediately. These gray lines are nighttime. So it pretty much immediately resumed that diel pattern of up and down. And I know I gave a previous presentation once of some 2008 data we had. And it's always kind of interesting with these points you see like this. When you see the data goes down in a point, I always theorize that potentially they're kind of moving down the shelf line as the day progresses and then working back up the shelf line in the evening before they ascend. So another thing that I'm sure people are always interested in is how fast are they moving up and down. So this particular line here was about 2,400 feet. It went from 2,400 feet all the way to the surface. It took about 45 minutes. So it's not too bad. It's not hauling butt, but it's moving pretty quick. I think I just looked at the first million or so data records to see what the fastest data point was, and it was about 16 miles an hour was the fastest it moved, and that's horizontal displacement. That's up and down, so it probably was much quicker because usually it's not going straight down, it's going at an angle. So you figure 16 could be 25, 30 miles an hour if you take into account angle of descent. Another thing that I always think is kind of interesting off South Florida here is like you look and it's going down to about 2,500 feet. And if you look at a map of the Florida Straits, it's not very deep in the Florida Straits. We're talking 420 fathoms or so, which is right about that 2,500 feet. So that's what's kind of interesting and unique about South Florida is they're really using like all the water column in the Florida Straits. They're not just, going halfway down. And you can see they're not going to the same depth every day. Like this day it was, about 1,800 feet, and this day it was 2,500 feet. But if we compare it to one of the other tags and look at kind of this black line kind of represents the estimated bottom depth along the track, you can see when it was off Florida, it's using that whole bottom. And then as soon as it got off that shelf, it went down to 16,000 feet. And it pretty much stayed the same depth profile, so it's kind of unique, I think, about our area here is that they're actually using a lot of the water column. And then one other interesting thing that we saw in the data, and I saw it actually twice, 2 different periods, once in May and once in June. But if we look at the daytime here, where all these little arrows are pointing to, you see all these lines going to the surface. Well, that's like basking events, and it's a lot over a short period of time. So you can see here, This one here is kind of normal daytime behavior where it goes to depth, stays at depth the whole day, and comes up at nighttime. But there's a period of about a week where it did this rapid movement to the surface. And it could potentially be courtship behavior or actually mating behavior. I know one of our colleagues in the Pacific theorized that they might actually be spawning during the day, whereas some tuna species will spawn at night. May to June is supposed to be kind of peak spawning time in this region. So I know one of our colleagues out of Spain, he had wrote a paper where they were looking at gravid female fish they were catching on, I think, longliners, and they had males coming up along with these ripe females that were ready to spawn, and they were saying they kind of couple up and kind of courtship behavior. And I know I've seen people talk about seeing free swimmers alongside. And this is just kind of all three of the tags together so you can see how they move together. These two fish were in pretty close proximity in June, even though one was tagged in the Keys and the other one was tagged up here in May. In June, they were both roughly around the same area. And then the two fish that were tagged in May both kind of passed through the same marine protected area up here. So there's always new things we'll learn, and like I said, we're just starting to look at this data right now, and I'm sure we'll come up with some even more interesting things as we dig deeper.
This here's a song about a huge fish I tangled with a few years back. Biggest fish I ever seen. Never seen anything like it, probably never will again. Most of this story is true. This one's called Big Mama. Well, I was sitting there in my boat, and I was thinking about big fish.